please enter your PIN followed by the pound key.
All right, I can see we have some folks that are chiming in right now, so we will give those folks an opportunity to get dialed in. And as they do so, just a reminder to please keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking. If I can tell on my end that there's some background noise coming from you, I will go ahead and mute you. But again, just ask that you keep yourself muted. There's no need to share your camera if you prefer not to, that's entirely fine. But again, just please keep yourself muted. If you do have a question as we go along, you can always unmute yourself and speak freely, that's fine. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Amanda Sternberg. I'm with the Homeless Action Network of Detroit. I'm the Performance Management Analyst. And it's great that you are all here. So this webinar, we are going to be talking about the process of applying for new project funding in the upcoming Continuum of Care competition. So a couple of housekeeping tips as well, as I mentioned before, just please keep yourself muted. Feel free to use the chat box as we go along. I will pause occasionally to look at what's in the chat or, pause to kind of open it up for questions. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be posted to HAND's website within a few days. So you can always go back and refer to it. Also, attendance at this webinar is not required in order to submit an application for new project funding. It's strongly encouraged because it'd be really helpful for you in the application, but it's not required. So a quick kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So the application process. We're going to be talking about the types of projects that applicants may apply for. I'm going to touch briefly on something that's different this year from prior years in terms of round one new project application process that we had earlier this year. Going to be talking about the amounts of funding, the types of new project funding that's available, our new project funding priorities and target populations of who can be served with these dollars. I'm going to talk about applicant and project requirements, project performance expectations, doing some highlights in the applications themselves, and then we're going to be walking through the PSH budget spreadsheet. So we'll definitely go into that in more detail, but just know that we're going to kind of take a bit of a break towards the end and then go through the PSH budget spreadsheet in some more detail. So sorry, there was just a little bit of background noise. Okay. So with that, with all of that, I also want to give a caveat that the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, which for those of you who have been around a while, you may be familiar with the phrase NOFA. They essentially have renamed it. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is the official notice from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that gives a lot of information on the amount of funding that we have, timelines, HUD's funding priorities. That has not yet been released. We don't know when it will be released. If HUD is operating on a typical timeline, it may come out in July, but this seems like there's very few typical timelines these days. So it has not yet been released. So kind of a lot of what I'm saying, should be taken kind of with that caveat that the NOFO is not released. And we always, start our local process ahead of HUD's release of the NOFO just because of the size of our system and we need to kind of keep things moving. But with that, that also means we do not know the entire amount of funding that's available or really any additional requirements that HUD may have in the NOFO. Once the NOFO is released, if there are adjustments that we need to make locally, we kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. It's pretty uncommon that we need to make significant adjustments other than maybe to like timelines. But that's just a sort of a heads up on that. So another kind of sort of quick thing, all of the materials from today are posted on HAND's website. Later on in the presentation, I will pull up our website as well so you can see exactly where they're at. But again, everything that I'm referencing or talking about today has been posted there. And like I said before, recording of our webinar and the slides will also be posted there in the next few days. So also wanted to just start off with making sure that everyone is aware of application deadline. Applications for this funding.
Yeah, I mean, that would be
applications for this funding are due by noon on June 25th. So that is a little more than a month from now. It's about 5 weeks. So please keep that deadline in mind as you're considering applying. Excuse me, they're due June 25th, and I'll talk a bit more about the submission process as well. We anticipate that the CoC board will be making decisions on which new projects to submit to HUD in September of this year. Again, that timeline of the board's decision-making process is subject to change depending on the release of the NOFO. Which I have to say, I've been using the phrase NOFA for the last 13 years. And so having to switch over to call it a NOFO is taking a lot in my brain. So I may slip up. So I want to take a moment to kind of walk through what this application process looks like. I see that there's some newer folks on this call, which is wonderful, maybe representing agencies that we haven't always worked with in the past within the Continuum of Care funding realm. So I just want to kind of walk through what this application process is about, because there are a number of different steps and sort of different players. So sort of the first step is the Continuum of Care, the CoC, releases the local RFP, request for proposals, and applications. So that's what's happening today. That is being released. Everything was actually posted as of yesterday. The development of that RFP and the application happens within committees, within the Continuum of Care, and HAND, the agency I work for. That is one of our primary roles, is to lead this application process. So first step is locally, we release an RFP and an application that reflects our local funding priorities of what it is that we want to fund locally to fill gaps in our system. And that's also aligned with what HUD essentially says we can use these funds for. The next step, so after agencies apply, those applications are reviewed against the evaluation criteria. And then the CoC board makes a decision locally on which applications to submit to HUD for funding. So again, that's the process we anticipate happening around September. So at that point, projects are submitted to HUD. There's an online portal called eSnaps that they're submitted through. I help agencies kind of walk through that eSnaps submission process. So that's not something that you kind of have to figure out on your own. I provide assistance with that. But essentially, after we make decisions here locally on how we want to use our money, we then submit those projects to HUD, and we have to rank and prioritize our projects. After those applications are submitted to HUD, HUD ultimately makes the final funding decision. These dollars, these Continuum of Care dollars, that's obviously federal funding, it flows through HUD, and so HUD makes the final funding decision. Now, part of our role in terms of HAND and the CoC is to make sure that we are submitting applications to HUD that are strong, that are going to align with HUD's funding priorities as well as our local priorities. And so, we're not going to necessarily submit an application to HUD that we think HUD might not fund this, because that would then, put our funding at risk of not getting it. But I guess my point being that ultimately HUD is going to make the final funding decision, and then after that, they enter into the contract with the agency. So as we kind of move into our discussion today, I'm going to be talking about a couple of different types of applications. So new applications and expansion applications. And I want to take a moment to define those terms to make sure that we all are kind of on the same page of what those terms mean. So when we talk about a new project application, that is referring to a project that does not currently receive any CoC, Continuum of Care funding, and is requesting to receive that funding for the first time. It could be a project that's already in operation, already serving people, already housing people. It just does not currently receive Continuum of Care funding. The agency may receive CoC funding for another project, but this project in particular does not currently receive CoC funding. That is a new project for this purpose. Then we have what are called expansion projects. So these are projects that do currently receive CoC funding, and they're requesting additional CoC funding to either add additional units of housing or to expand the services in an existing project. And if these expansion projects are funded, essentially HUD issues one grant agreement and tacks on the additional funding to your current grant agreement. Also, just sort of flow chart might help to explain this a little bit. Additionally, if you're wondering, well, am I applying new or expansion? What am I doing? Because there's different application forms, different evaluation criteria. So this kind of flow chart will help illustrate it. So the first big question to ask yourself is, does the project that I'm applying for currently receive CoC funding? And if the answer to that is no, then it's a simple sort of answer. You're applying as a new project application. If you are not sure if your project currently receives CoC funding, you can certainly reach out to me. I can let you know. But that's sort of the one branch of this flow chart. The second branch to consider is, does the project I'm thinking of, does it currently receive CoC funding? If yes, then the question is, okay, am I trying to request additional funding or more funding to either increase the number of units or expand the services for this project? If yes, then you're going to complete the expansion project application. So that's the route that you'll go. If after you get through this process, you think, no, I have this current CoC project, I'm not in a place to really, request additional funding, then you're just going to submit for your renewal funding. And I know those of you who currently receive CoC funding, I think for the most part, were on Monday's webinar where we went over that entire process. But this is just to help you sort of think through if you're new or expansion. And so hopefully that kind of helps to clarify that. One other thing to keep in mind when we use the phrase new and expansion to sort of make a distinction between these two types of applications. At the end of the day, though, these projects are both funded, types of projects are both funded using our pot of new project funding or reallocated funding. So they're both considered new in the fact that they are being funded or requesting funding that is not currently being used to fund other projects. We are allocated a specific kind of pot of money every year, which is called our CoC bonus money and our domestic violence bonus money, which I'll get to in a little bit. And it's out of those pots of money, new money that's not already being allocated to renewal projects that we use to fund either the new or the expansion project. So in that case, both new and expansion are considered new projects. So it's hopefully not too confusing. It's that hopefully helped to kind of clarify some of that, but let me know if I can clarify that further. As I mentioned roughly before, there are different evaluation criteria for new versus expansion project. This is detailed in the RFP, so I would encourage you to take a close look at that. In a nutshell, our expansion projects are evaluated more heavily on the past performance of that project they are seeking to expand. So part of the rationale behind that is if you are requesting more money for an existing CoC project, we want to make sure that that existing CoC project is performing well, is meeting our expectations locally before we give more money to it. So that's why for expansion projects, there's a pretty heavy evaluation component on the performance of that renewal project. Again, please, the RFP itself goes into a lot of detail of the evaluation criteria. I'm not going to go into a ton of like the nitty-gritty details on all of that today, but you are encouraged to read through that closely. So I want to talk now about the types of projects or the types of applications that we'll be considering. So in addition to the new and expansion, this lays out the actual kind of program model or type of program that we're considering to fund. And so our decision on what types of projects to consider for funding are based on a number of factors. One is what HUD allows us to fund with these dollars. That's a big driving factor. We're under certain regulatory requirements on what we can fund and HUD's own funding priorities. But also we really looked at our local community, our communities and continuum of care goals and priorities and the gaps in our system, and are also using that information to drive our decision on what we want to fund. So applications for the following kind of project types will be considered. So permanent supportive housing. So that is a long-term housing that people live in. It's targeted to people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. An individual lives in that housing indefinitely, and then supportive services are provided to help keep them housed. That is a really high-level overview of permanent supportive housing, and you can certainly, mine the depths of what PSH is for a long time. Permanent supportive housing, what we can look at is either scattered site, meaning the clients are renting units throughout the community based on, their preferences and the landlords that you've engaged with. Or it can be project-based, meaning you have, one set building and this building has all of the PSH units. It could be, a building with 10 units. It could be a building with 100 units. That's going to depend on, your agency and the scope of the project. So again, we'll consider new or expansion applications for PSH. The second kind of main type of programming that we'll consider is rapid rehousing. And so rapid rehousing is time-limited rental assistance that people receive along with supportive services. The goal is to ultimately exit that person to permanent housing when that rental assistance ends. So again, we consider either new or expansion rapid rehousing programs. One kind of particular thing to note is that we're particularly interested in reviewing applications for rapid rehousing programs that specifically target people fleeing domestic violence. We have a specific pool of funding called our domestic violence bonus funding, which is to specifically serve people fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking. HUD includes both of those populations. And so we're really interested in funding some new rapid rehousing program, particularly for folks fleeing domestic violence. We'll also consider new rapid rehousing programs for a more general population as well. And the last kind of project type that we'll consider are applications for coordinated entry supportive services only. That's kind of a long title, but essentially this is funding that supports our coordinated entry system, locally known as CAM. So as an organization, you may submit more than one proposal. There's no limit to how many applications you may submit. There are different application forms, and so you definitely want to be sure that you're using the correct application. I gave the website, the web address to our website there again, and again at the end of this presentation I'll pull that up so you can kind of see where it's at. But just my point being that if you as an agency think you want to submit for both PSH and Rapid, you certainly may. You'll be filling out 2 applications and submitting 2 applications to me, and they'll be reviewed kind of independent of each other, essentially. So the types of projects that we will not be considering this year, and again, the reason why we're not considering projects of this type are either, restrictions on what we either know or anticipate HUD will allow us to fund, or just for our local, again, the gaps and our local needs. So HMIS, so this is and what I mean by this is the direct grants that, so particularly HAND as the HMIS lead agency in Detroit receives specific HMIS funding to implement the HMIS system. So we're not going to be considering new grants for that HMIS lead agency. You as a project applicant may request an HMIS budget line in your individual project application, because you as an agency will be required to do HMIS data entry. And so you will be able to request, funding for a data entry staff person or what have you at your agency, but we're just not going to be considering applications to fund the HMIS lead agency. We're additionally not considering new coordinated entry for people fleeing domestic violence. Also, there's a newer type of project that HUD has made available in recent years. It's called a joint component project, which combines the elements of transitional housing and rapid rehousing into one project type. So we're not considering any new joint components this year, other than expanding a rapid rehousing portion of our existing joint component project. We do have one of these projects currently in the CoC, and so we would consider expanding that rapid rehousing portion of that existing project, but only that portion of it. Excuse me. Permanent supportive housing projects do need to be targeted to chronically homeless single adults, or what's called the dedicated plus population, and I'll get to that in a little bit more as well. So if a project application comes through and it's proposing to serve families in permanent supportive housing, that's not going to be considered, simply because our data does not demonstrate a need for additional PSH for families. Conversely, our data really demonstrates that people who are experiencing chronic homelessness are far and away single adults. And so that is the type of intervention that we really need for that population. And lastly, we will not be considering for funding kind of a standalone transitional housing program. For many years, we've not been able to even, HUD has not allowed us to fund new transitional housing programs. We do have a couple of renewal transitional housing programs remaining in the community, which are still eligible for renewal funding, but we're not going to be looking to fund any new just standalone transitional housing programs. Okay, I want to talk briefly now about something that's a bit different this year. Just to, again, this is goes into a bit more detail in the RFP itself, but just want to make sure that everyone is aware of kind of something that happened last year. So last year in 2020, we released an RFP for new funding last November in what we anticipated would be a 2020 CoC competition. There was a lot of unknowns over the course of last year on what was going to happen with the CoC funding. So we released an RFP last fall. Those applications were submitted early in January, reviewed and scored. And then we got word from HUD that HUD canceled the competition, meaning there was no new funding. So the CoC board in May made a decision on these applications, which we're now kind of calling round one applications, that the two highest scoring applications from that round, which were from Cass Community Social Services and NSO, would move forward to be funded. Specifically, Cass's was funded through a grant transfer opportunity that was available at that time. And then the application from NSO, the board essentially said this was one of our highest scoring applications. We are committing to submitting this application to HUD as a new project in the 2021 competition. The 5 remaining applications from round one are given an opportunity to essentially resubmit their applications in round 2, which is kind of this funding round that we're talking about now, essentially round 2. These applicants have received feedback on that first application that they submitted, and they are given the opportunity to, strengthen or modify any of those responses. They will then be resubmitting and re-reviewed according to the evaluation criteria in the RFP. So we went this route and by allowing those sort of round one applicants to resubmit and strengthen their initial response in trying to find this balance between giving some priority to those that submitted in round one, while also inviting additional applicants to apply. And overall, we really want to make sure that we are able to submit to HUD, strong project applications that are going to utilize all of the funding that is available to us, which again is a little unknown. So to Jane's question, is round 2 really round 1 for the 2020 NOFO? You could think of it that way as well, because there really was no 2020 money because HUD canceled the competition. We're referring to it as round 2 simply because we're using the same evaluation criteria, the same kind of local funding priorities. Really nothing has changed locally. So between what we released last fall and now, so we're kind of seeing them as sort of being round 1 and round 2. So the amount of funding that we currently have available to allocate to new projects is unknown. We won't know that until the NOFO is released. There's 3 main buckets of funding. Reallocated funding, which is a potential. There's been really a couple of years since we've had reallocated funding, and that's funding that is from a currently existing Continuum of Care program that for whatever reason is not being submitted for renewal funding. The CoC can take those dollars and put it towards a new project. We won't know if there's any reallocated funding until later this year. The 2 kind of pots of money that we are anticipating, and that will, again, once the NOFO is released, we'll know more, is what we call CoC bonus. And so this is the funding that would fund, again, the permanent supportive housing, the rapid rehousing or coordinated entry, and the domestic violence bonus, which would fund, again, those rapid rehousing programs targeted to people fleeing domestic violence. So this chart gives an estimate of how much money we think may be available. This is only an estimate. It could be more, it could be less than this. We're estimating about $2 to $2.5 million in bonus funding. Again, it could be much more than this. We really don't know. But the types of projects that we would consider, again, to be funded, I sort of touched on this briefly. This is same information, just sort of presented in a different way. Is that we'll consider new and expansion projects for all of those project types that you see there. So PSH, rapid rehousing, and coordinated entry. All of those projects we would consider to fund with our CoC bonus dollars. For the domestic violence bonus dollars, we are anticipating maybe $1.5 to $2.5 million in that pool of funding, which is a separate pool. We can't combine these 2 pools of money. They're sort of distinct in that way. And for the domestic violence bonus funding, again, we'll consider funding either new or expansion projects for rapid rehousing for people fleeing domestic violence, or an expansion of the rapid rehousing portion of, again, that one joint component project. And I see there was another question in the chat box. Will there be a round 1 for the FY2021 NOFO? I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that, because really the purpose of this process, I think the best answer is to say no. I mean, really what we're talking about here is kind of round 2 of really, you know, identifying applicants to submit for the project funding, the new project funding that will be available in the 2021 NOFO. That's really kind of what lies before us. And so we're using, you know, a couple of the applications, or particularly one of the applications that was submitted earlier this year in round 1. And then this process here is going to help us to identify additional applicants to submit for the rest of that money. So I'm not sure if you want to clarify that question, Jane, if I didn't quite get at it. So for you as a project applicant, there's no limit to the amount of funding that you can request. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you can submit more than one application if you choose. You know, just be mindful of the kind of amounts given in those charts. If you submit a project application requesting, you know, $10 million or, you know, a really large amount, that, you know, we may look at that a little askance. But just know there's no limit. You know, it's not like you can only request up to X amount in your application. You do have to demonstrate match for your application. So that sometimes is a deciding factor for agencies on how much they can apply for. So in terms of project start dates, if you submit for funding and if HUD selects your project to be funded, when would this project start? So new projects, which again are projects that do not currently receive CoC funding, it could be programming that's already happening. It could be programming that would start for the first time if it was funded. That money, that project kind of funding would be available roughly the 4th quarter of 2022. So almost a year after you apply. That's about how long it takes for between when you apply, when HUD makes their funding announcements, and when the money actually kind of hits your bank account, for lack of a better word. 4th quarter 2022. If you are applying for expansion funding and that project is funded, the start date will be the same as the start date of your current project, because HUD just combines that into your current project application. So for example, say you have a current CoC program that has a July 1st start date, and you apply for expansion funding and that project is funded, that new money would be available starting, you know, July 1st, 2022. It's just going to be combined with your current grant. So that may be helpful to kind of think through when these projects might start. Okay, I see another question around this round 1, round 2. So maybe clarify. So this round 1 and round 2 that we're doing, so this is not typical. I'm gonna pause for a moment to try to clarify this. So typically in a typical competition, we release the RFP, we release the applications, agencies apply, they're reviewed, we make the CoC board makes decisions on how to allocate that funding. That was what we intended to do in 2020. There was a lot of unknowns over the course of the entire year 2020 of what was going to happen with the FY2020 competition from HUD. We went throughout the kind of entire year not knowing what HUD was going to do because of the pandemic. This is all related, you know, to the pandemic. Because we didn't know what HUD was going to do, we didn't want to be caught sort of having to make a last-minute decision on, oh, HUD is making all this new funding available in the fiscal year 2020 competition. We now need to hurry up and decide how we're going to allocate it. We wanted to make sure we could have sort of a thoughtful process. So we were anticipating that there would have been a 2020 competition with new funding in the fiscal year 2020. We were anticipating all of this throughout last year. That led us to release our NOFA last fall, We had discussions prior to the release of that NOFA throughout, the spring and the summer of 2020 on new project funding priorities, all of that. We released the NOFA in the fall. Applications were submitted in early January. And then we found out a couple of weeks after those applications were submitted that HUD canceled the FY2020 competition, which meant there was no new funding available in 2020. For those of you who currently receive CoC grants, you'll know that your grant was automatically renewed. You just automatically renewed, you got your grant agreements, so there was no competition. At the same time, we realized we had these project applications that we had 7 applications that submitted in response to that RFP we released last fall. And so we had to make a decision. What are we going to do with these applications? How do so we went through and we reviewed them because we really felt like we needed to know what's in these applications, what is the quality of the projects that are being submitted, what is the kind of capacity of agencies who did respond to to our local RFP. And within those conversations, we also realized, there should be a way that we can somehow, take advantage of the fact or leverage the fact that we have these applications that did submit. So how do we use that information kind of going forward? So through all those conversations, and also at the same time, we did have a small grant that was being relinquished from another agency that we had to make a decision on who to transfer that money to. There's a lot of kind of complexities with that, but we had to identify another agency to transfer those funds to. Otherwise, we would have lost those funds. So that was kind of wrapped up in this as well. So with that, the applications submitted last January were reviewed and scored. Again, we're now calling that kind of round 1 because it was round 1 of applications to use up this pot of money that we ended up not having in 2020, but we know is coming in 2021. So those decisions were made, and I referenced earlier, the 2 top scoring applications, one was funded with the grant transfer funds. The top scoring application, which was the NSO project, the board committed to funding, said this one we're going to move forward to fund with our funding available in 2021 because it was high scoring, it meets a need just because of everything within the application. The remaining 5 applications, when we reviewed them, we looked at them and we said, there may be opportunities for these applications to be perhaps strengthened, improved upon. At the same time, we recognized there are probably other agencies out there that maybe want to apply for some of this funding. And so we're going to reopen the competition. So that's this round 2 to give additional agencies a chance to apply for this funding. So think of it both round 1 and round 2, these applications, they're all being funded with the same pots of money, this money that's going to be available in the FY2021 NOFO competition. So it's an unusual process. This is not our norm. I don't anticipate this being the norm going forward. We just had to adjust because of the way things came about with the 2020 competition and the cancellation. So. Okay, I'm gonna kind of move on here. So kind of getting back to what you can apply for. So permanent supportive housing applications you may submit an application requesting supportive services funding only. This is a newer thing that we have done this year, in that historically a permanent supportive housing project, the budget had to request both funding for units and services. We've made a change in response to what we're hearing from our PSH providers, and again, the needs in the community, and that PSH projects may request just services funding only. That would apply to both new or expansion projects. This chart gives a broad overview of the allowable costs in the different applications, the different project types that you may apply for. There is whole regulatory requirements around these budget lines that I'm not going to kind of go into. I'm going to drop a link in the chat box in a minute about some additional resources, but just kind of at a glance, the specific budget lines that these different project types can apply for. And you see the yes and the no. This is not something that hand made up. This is driven by HUD's regulations on the types of budget lines that agencies can apply for. And this is in the project applications as well. Okay, let me pause on this other question. So the question is, so the recommendations from new funding competition last year will stand for 2021, and the other applicants will receive out of the 2021 new funding pot what was recommended in 2020. So the other applicants, when you say other applicants, you mean anyone that applies in this round would be funded out of, yes, the new pot of money coming through in 2021. And so also their application is likewise going to be funded from this, I say funded, HUD makes the ultimate decision, but will be funded from whatever new funding is available in 2021. The CAS application is being funded separately through a grant transfer. It's kind of a separate process. They're getting the funding for their application through a grant transfer that's kind of being handled separately. So, okay, so these next few slides, I want to kind of go through, hopefully not to make things more complex. So here's what's going to happen. We as a CoC, we're going to get all these applications from you. Some are going to be applying for PSH. Some of you might be applying for Rapid. Some of you might be applying for coordinated entry money. We're going to get all these different applications. They're going to be reviewed. And then we're also going to have those sort of a finite dollar amount of new money that we can apply to these applications. So how are we going to prioritize the funding that we have with these different project types, considering that we are accepting applications for PSH, Rapid, and coordinated entry? So these next few slides are meant to kind of show this. And again, this is in the RFP. So I'm not going to linger on this too much because I do want to kind of keep us moving. But essentially, we're going to look at our PSH projects. And first, we're going to want to fund projects that are bringing additional units online. And we have kind of a unit goal of we want to try to get at least 40 new units of PSH to be able to have more housing to house people. If we have money remaining, then we're going to look to fund PSH projects that are requesting just services to kind of augment the services that they're funding. If we have money remaining, then we're going to fund the rest of our PSH projects. If we have money remaining, then we're going to look to fund new or expansion rapid rehousing projects. And then if we have funding remaining, we're going to fund our coordinated entry projects. So the main thing I want to, the takeaway for this is that with our CoC bonus funding, we're going to first prioritize funding permanent supportive housing programs. That doesn't mean you can't apply for rapid rehousing or coordinated entry, or that you shouldn't apply for those project types. This simply means that when we have to decide of all these, great applications that we have received, which project types are we going to prioritize the use of our funding for? And we really settled on PSH because it furthers our community's goals to end chronic homelessness, the permanent supportive housing programming, because there's been a lot of other funding that has come into the community for rapid rehousing, but really it's all targeted towards our goal of ending chronic homelessness. So that's for the bonus money. As I mentioned earlier, we have, another pool of money called the domestic violence bonus funding. This is for, this would fund rapid rehousing projects for people that are fleeing domestic violence. So first we would look to fund new or expansion rapid rehousing, just kind of standalone rapid rehousing projects for people fleeing domestic violence. Oops. And then after that, we would look to fund a project that would expand on the rapid rehousing portion of our joint component project. So this is, again, just a way for us to have these kind of priorities set in place so that when it comes to the decision-making process, we know how we're going to allocate our funds. So I've seen a couple of additional questions in the chat box. So there's a question, is adding a supportive services line to a PSH project that was only funded for rental assistance expansion or a new project? So Jane, I'm assuming you're talking about a CoC rental assistance, formerly known as Shelter Plus Care. That would be an expansion project because that project currently receives CoC funding. Right now, it's just getting CoC funding for rental assistance. So you can apply for an expansion grant that would essentially tack on, if funded, a supportive services line to that rental assistance project. So that's an expansion grant. The question, are there unit targets for new or expansion rapid rehousing? We have not set unit targets for rapid rehousing. And then another question, if we want to submit an expansion, rapid rehousing expansion, do you submit one application that includes the renewal and the expansion? That's a good question. So if you're submitting an expansion application for either rapid or PSH, you're going to submit your renewal project piece of it using the renewal project application process. So everything I went over on Monday, all of that you're going to do for your renewal project. Then you're going to submit an application for the expansion portion using kind of this process here. So you really are going to be submitting two applications. They're going to be reviewed independent of each other, and they will be submitted to HUD independent of each other. If HUD then decides to fund them, that's then when you'll get one grant agreement and one contract. But until HUD makes that funding decision, they're kind of two separate things, with the hope that they eventually become one. So yes, that's the same. That's the same for either expansion, either PSH or rapid. And then Jean's questions, if you add or request additional supportive services, do you need to add additional households to be served? No, not necessarily. There's questions in the application around case management ratios, which I think kind of gets to that. We would want to see, how are the additional, I'll kind of get to this more, but actually, I'm going to pause, Jean. I'm going to get to your question a little bit more detail, just so I can kind of keep going. If I forget to come back to it, remind me. So I want to talk about, we've touched on this briefly, target populations for these different types of projects. So again, permanent supportive housing do need to be targeted to chronically homeless single adults, including people who meet this definition of what's called dedicated plus. That entire definition is given in the RFP. Essentially, it's people who are very close to being chronically homeless. People who are chronically homeless have a disabling condition. They have a long history of homelessness. There's certain, it's very specific on what it kind of takes to be chronically homeless. Our data locally shows overwhelmingly our chronically homeless population are single adults. And so that's why for our local purposes here, we are targeting our new PSH funding to that single adult population, and that we're not going to consider PSH projects that are targeted to families. We have currently existing PSH programming that is targeted to families. So when we do have families who need PSH, which is, it's not a common occurrence, we have resources available to serve them. So I don't want to make it sound like we don't care about families. We certainly do. We do have existing resources to serve them. Our data overwhelmingly shows we need permanent supportive housing targeted to the single adults. For rapid rehousing, again, it's a little bit broad. This is unless you're applying for the domestic violence bonus funding. Rapid rehousing funded with the DV bonus does have to serve people, which families, individuals, or youth, so anyone that is fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking. And again, the RFP goes into detail on what that actually means. Non-domestic violence, rapid rehousing, likewise, is pretty broad. Families, individuals, youth, they have to be Category 1 or Category 4 homeless. Those definitions likewise are given in the application. but essentially it's people who are in shelters, unsheltered, and the category 4 is, again, sort of a domestic violence category as well. My point being, rapid rehousing is a bit broader in terms of the target population, whereas permanent supportive housing, we're really narrowing in on our community need, which is chronically homeless single adults. So all of these projects, if they are funded, all of the referrals must come through coordinated entry, which locally is known as CAM. That is a regulatory requirement. I know for many of you on this call, you are accustomed to this. For folks who may be new, this may be a newer thing, but referrals to permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing are made in accordance with our community's local prioritization factors. Really, the goal of coordinated entry is one of the overarching goals is to ensure that we are using our resources targeted to people who are most in need of the housing and services. So if you are funded and getting referrals from coordinated entry is a new thing to you, there will be plenty of training on what that looks like. But just in essence, just know that your referrals to these programs are coming through coordinated entry. So it's not as though you are going to be able to just take referrals of your own, kind of through your own agency, like you may take referrals for other programming in your organization. Some overarching requirements for applicants. You need to be a you need to be a nonprofit organization or a state or local unit of government or public housing agency. Those are all eligible applicants. If you are a current recipient or subrecipient of CoC funding, you do need to be in what we call good standing with HUD. Essentially, when we have a sense, when we get these applications in, we do kind of give HUD a heads up just to let them know of who's applying. They have the opportunity to, if there's anything that they feel we need to know to keep in mind that we should take into consideration, they can do that at that time. We also do ask for your HUD monitoring reports, which is really what we look to make sure everything is shipshape with HUD. So some overall general requirements for all project types. So regardless of the type of programming that you're applying for, again, I go into more detail this in the RFP. Adherence to housing first. So that's the kind of the first overarching one, meaning the participation in services is not required for receiving housing. People are able to participate in the services that are provided based on what they identify that they want to work on and kind of at their own pace. So we don't link participation in services with their ability to retain their housing. Their ability to retain their housing is going to depend on their compliance with the lease agreement largely. But that is kind of one of the, we could have multi-day trainings on housing first. So that's barely scratching the surface, but just know that is a value that we hold highly here in the continuum. There are different written standards and policies and procedures that projects have to be mindful of. I provide hyperlinks to those documents in the RFP. Participation in coordinated entry, which I touched on briefly. Compliance with all HUD regulations, including the match requirements. You do need to demonstrate 25% match for your projects. Compliance with the HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System. These projects do require data entry into HMIS. If HMIS is new to you and if you are selected for funding, you will receive a lot of training on using HMIS, but just know that that is a significant requirement and it's not necessarily for the light of heart. There's kind of a lot there. If you are seeking funding for the domestic violence bonus funding, you may need to use a comparable HMIS system, which does add another layer of complexity to it. So just be mindful of that. We are going to look that if you are funded, that you're able to enroll your first participant within 3 months of getting that grant agreement or within 3 months of completing rehab. We are not using CoC funding dollars to fund rehab, but if the project that you're applying for does require rehab, it's being paid for by another source, we would expect that you're able to start to serve someone within 3 months following that rehab or 3 months following getting that grant agreement. The purpose being that once you get this money, we want to see it rolling. We want to start housing people. We want to start serving people. We don't want it to just kind of sit there and lag. There's some environmental review requirements, which again, I linked to that in the RFP. A hand works closely with the city and the agencies to kind of get that done. So hopefully it's not too heavy of a lift on your end, but that is an additional requirement. There's also an assessment fee for all of our current agencies that receive Continuum of Care funding. There's a small portion of that dollar amount that does need to be paid to hand. It supports our work as the collaborative applicant in these efforts. I don't have the percentage off the top of my head. It's less than 1% of your entire grant. If that's a new thing to you, I'm more than happy to kind of give more information on that. If you currently receive CoC funding, that should be a familiar kind of concept to you. So the next few slides, I'm gonna go over and talk about some sort of specific requirements for these specific project types. And some of this is gonna be repetitive because I've already touched on it. But for permanent supportive housing programs, either new or expansion, we are not going to consider applications for SROs or single room occupancies types of programming for a couple of reasons. One, we currently have SRO style permanent supportive housing in our continuum. And our experience has been that when clients are coming through coordinated entry, we find that really folks more so want a different type of housing. You know, they want a type of housing where, so an SRO typically has, you know, a single bedroom that the individual may share a bathroom with someone, or there may be a communal bathroom down the hall. There's, you know, going to be like a common dining room area, so not any kind of kitchen facility. SRO think maybe more sort of like a college dorm. That's the best way that I think of it in my mind. What we find is that folks coming through coordinated entry typically prefer studio apartments, one bedroom apartments, you know, an apartment where they have a little bit more privacy, a little bit more autonomy. And so we're really just trying to be responsive to what we're hearing from clients. Also, we do currently have SRO programming, and we don't right now see a need to fund additional new SRO units. I've already spoken about point number 2. So your project application, you may only request a 1-year budget. After the end of that first year budget, your application is eligible to be considered for renewal funding in additional 1-year cycles. Applications are always reviewed, evaluated annually. So, you know, at the end of that first year, you'd be kind of like up for and eligible for a renewal, you know, for subsequent years. I touched briefly on what the difference between scattered site and project-based. If you apply for a project-based unit, you do need to include with your application documentation that demonstrates you have site control over that property. So either a deed or a long-term lease agreement. You know, if you just kind of like are driving by a building in Detroit, you're like, hey, this looks like a good property to do for PSH, but you have no site control, you don't own it, you don't have a long-term lease agreement, you know, we're not going to be able to move forward with that. So you have to be able to demonstrate that, yes, this is essentially my building. For rapid rehousing, again, I touched on a lot of this already. Rapid rehousing projects do need to provide tenant-based rental assistance, and obviously you can request supportive services as well. I kind of touched briefly on the target populations. So rapid rehousing programs do have a regulatory requirement that participants do need to meet at least monthly with a case manager. So even though we would say, you know, for permanent or for, you know, housing first model, services are voluntary, yes, that is true. And at the same time, rapid rehousing do have this regulatory requirement of monthly case management. So just, you know, that can take different forms, that can look different, especially, you know, kind of in the light of COVID and all of that. But just keep in mind that is a regulatory requirement. And again, the 1-year budget requirement applies. For coordinated entry, supportive services applications, there's a couple of things to be mindful of here. So for these applications, we are going to be requiring a letter of support from the CAM Governance Committee. So the CAM Governance Committee really kind of governs the coordinated entry process. In the application form for these coordinated entry grants, there is a template that you as the applicant agency would fill out, submit to hand by June 9. We would then facilitate getting that signed off as the CAM Governance Committee chooses. You would then receive that back to submit in your application by June 25th. This is also all detailed in the project application. Again, the one-year budget thing holds for coordinated entry grants. And coordinated entry grants additionally has specific activities that can be requested. And these, the specifics of what these activities entail is likewise in the RFP and the application. But we would really be looking to fund access point activities, navigation activities. Those are the two kind of things that we're prioritizing. If there are other types of activities that you as an applicant feel is important to be funded with this coordinated entry grant, you can propose that, but then you do need to provide, sufficient kind of data and a description in the application of why these activities, apart from access point or navigation, would fill a gap in our coordinated entry system. So if you're interested or thinking about coordinated entry funding, please be sure to read that application closely to understand that. So I want to touch briefly now on what we're calling competitive characteristics. So these are kind of overall characteristics that if you as an agency are able to demonstrate this, you may be more likely to be selected for funding. I'm using may because it's not a given. I wanted to point out that these are some things that we take into consideration when we consider who we want to fund. This doesn't mean that if you can't demonstrate any of this, you're absolutely out of the running. That doesn't mean that at all. We take a lot of things into consideration, but these are just some elements that are really going to kind of make your application be even stronger. So the extent to which you can demonstrate experience providing the type of programming that's being requested. I think that's not uncommon for a lot of grant applications. The extent to which you're able to demonstrate these case management ratios. With PSH of having a 1 to 20, meaning one case manager to 20 clients, Rapid Rehousing a 1 to 25. This is something we've really started talking about a lot over this past year. The purpose being that, we want to make sure that folks who are being served in these programs are receiving adequate services, and that we're not having case managers that have these overwhelming caseloads, so that it's impacting the services that the clients receive. So we're going to be looking at those ratios. The extent to which you're able to demonstrate the ability for PSH programming, at least, leveraging Medicaid resources to augment the services, is going to be a good thing. Again, if you don't currently bill Medicaid for services funding, that doesn't mean you're out of the running. If you are able to, that is a good thing, and it may make you a bit more competitive. Ability to manage federal funding is something that will also be taken into consideration. I've referenced very briefly continuum of care regulations. Again, we could spend an entire week worth of training going around on the CoC regs, plus all the other regs that come into place when you have federal funding. Managing federal funding is not easy. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of things that you need to have in place to be compliant. And so that is one of the things that we do look at in the application is an agency's experience with federal funding. Again, if you've never received federal funding, that doesn't mean you're totally out of the running. It's something that we look at, and that, again, if you have that experience, may give you a bit of a more competitive advantage. So having leases that do not require service participation, that really gets to the experience with doing housing first and experience using HMIS. Excuse me. So if your application is funded, you're submitted to HUD, HUD says, yes, we want to fund you. So then what? So I mentioned earlier that projects are reviewed and evaluated every year by hand. That helps us to determine how we want to continue to use our funding. So I want to talk briefly about some of the project performance expectations, excuse me, for these projects if you are funded. And so these elements are, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just something to keep in mind that if you are funded, these are kind of some performance expectations that we are expecting are going to be looking at with your project, which to help determine continued funding of the program. So for permanent supportive housing projects, the first thing off the bat is what percentage of your clients are you able to retain in permanent supportive housing or move to other permanent housing? You know, we're trying to end homelessness. That's our overarching goal of what we're trying to do in the community, what we're trying to do with these funds. You know, people need to have permanent housing in order for their homelessness to be ended. So that is a key component that we're looking at with our permanent supportive housing programs. There's a number of other things we look at too to determine kind of project performance and project quality, the extent to which clients are increasing their income, how long it takes to house clients. Do people return to homelessness after they've left your program? And there's some, you know, kind of stipulations within that, but if they exit your program to permanent housing, are they coming back to homelessness within a short period of time? And kind of what is that telling us? We definitely want to look to see that you're keeping your units filled and that you're fully expending your grant. We want to use every resource available to us. These dollars are precious. The units that we fund with them are needed. And so we definitely want to see that these units are kept full and that you're expending your dollars. Also compliance with HMIS and coordinated entry requirements. And as I go through these two, I also want to acknowledge that we are aware that COVID has impacted a lot of the ways in which we operate on the ground, which can impact some of these performance expectations. I'm not denying that at all. I'm just saying kind of overall, in general, these are the types of performance expectations that we look at for our projects for PSH. Excuse me. For rapid rehousing, it's going to look very similar. One of the differences being that one of the main performance expectations we look at for rapid rehousing programs is the extent to which people exit that program to permanent housing. Excuse me. Rapid rehousing is a short-term program, unlike permanent supportive housing where people can stay in that program indefinitely, really. Rapid rehousing, there's an expectation that person is going to leave at some point. And so we really want to make sure they are leaving to a permanent housing resource and they are not returning back to homelessness. But really the other performance expectations are very much the same, helping them increase their income, how long it takes to get them housed, occupancy expenditures, kind of all of that. Lastly, some performance expectations for these coordinated entry grants. We want to look to see that clients are satisfied with the navigation and access point services they're receiving. We want to see that there's these match ready packets that are submitted by the navigators, and there's, again, details on what that means in the applications. There's certain housing choice voucher or HCV list management requirements that are kind of expected there that we're going to want to see. Big aspect of coordinated entry is making referrals to vacancies. And so we definitely look at how long it takes to fill those referrals and compliance with HMIS requirements as well. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to go over some application highlights right now, just some things that are a bit newer to our new project applications or things that we've kind of changed a little bit. So the first thing, and I have here sort of the element of the application and then kind of which project type it applies to. So for permanent supportive housing projects, there is a budget spreadsheet that I'm going to be going over, I'm going to walk through in greater detail at the end of this presentation. But if you've applied for new PSH funding in the past, and maybe you haven't for a couple of years, you're going to notice this budget spreadsheet is very different than what you've submitted in the past. So just be kind of aware of that. This budget spreadsheet is for both new and expansion PSH projects, just PSH. Rapid rehousing budgets kind of in the application look like they have in the past. Service model description. So this is a question in the application for both PSH and rapid rehousing programs. That's a bit new or just kind of expanded from what we've asked in the past, but there's a question where you're going to really have to describe in some detail the services that are being provided to the client. So we sort of have expanded on that question a bit. There's a question around case manager to client ratio and kind of where your project is at or would be with that those ratios that I gave before, kind of 1 to 20 with PSH or 1 to 25 with rapid rehousing. And so I think, Jean, kind of backing up to your question a bit, if you have a PSH project and you're just requesting services, one of the questions is really going to ask you, how would this increased service funding help improve client outcomes? And additionally, kind of that case manager client ratio question is built in there as well. What is your current ratio? What would the ratio be with this additional funding? So if you are requesting just services funding, you don't necessarily have to then propose, I'm going to now serve X number of additional households with these services funding. Part of the reason for that is what we are hearing from our permanent supportive housing providers is the need for additional services funding. You have, perhaps you have caseloads, your case managers, your caseloads are higher than that 1 to 20, and that's impacting the quality of services that clients are receiving. It's obviously impacting your case managers. So we are trying to be responsive to kind of what we're hearing in that regard. And so with that, we are again allowing permanent supportive housing programs to just request additional services to serve kind of the current number of units, let's say, that your program is currently funded to provide, without then also having to, it would seem a little sort of defeat the purpose, I guess, in a way, if we would say, oh yes, you can request just services, but then you have to serve more people as well. We're trying to acknowledge the fact or respond to the fact that you need some additional services funding to serve the people you already have. So that's kind of what's allowed there. So Jean, if I didn't really get to your question, please clarify in the chat. So use of peer supports, this is something that we're going to be looking at for both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing programs. We want to see the extent to which peers are incorporated in the programming. For rapid rehousing projects that are applying for domestic violence bonus funding, there's a question in the application around how the programming would increase the safety of your participants and how you would provide trauma-informed services. So we really feel like this is an important element to take into consideration for these projects that are specifically targeted to serve people who have experienced trauma and who have experienced violence. And we really want to make sure that our project applicants have the experience and the capacity to appropriately meet those needs of those clients. So an additional kind of application highlight that we take into consideration, the performance of current CoC funded projects. This applies for both new and expansion, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing and coordinated entry as well. This is not anything that you as an applicant has to respond to in your new project application. This is a score that is generated once the review of your renewal project is completed. It's kind of folded into the application score for your new project. If you do not currently receive CoC funding, then this is just not going to apply to you. You don't need to kind of worry about that. For expansion projects, we have a question where in the application that's going to ask about your experience in ramping up past projects. How have you done that? What have you done when you've run into snags in the past? Really, this is to help us get a sense of your ability to kind of get a project going and get it off the ground. A couple of application highlights for coordinated entry grants. Again, I sort of touched on this as previously. For both new and expansion projects, we have some sort of narrow focus on the types of activities that can be requested, access point or navigation. If you do want to request a different type of activity to be funded with that funding, you will be asked to provide some data and rationale in the application to substantiate that. Again, coordinated entry grants do require a letter of support from the CAM governance committee. There is a template in your project application that you are required to use in additional instructions in the project application. Essentially, you're going to complete that template. You are going to send it to hand staff, specifically my colleague Jasmine Morgan, by June 9. We are then going to work with the CAM governance committee for their review. And if they agree to sign off on that, you will receive a signed copy of that letter of support that you then just slide in with your application materials and submit to me by June 25th. With your application, there's a number of attachments that you will need to submit. Some of these are monitoring reports from the City of Detroit or HUD as applicable. If you receive or have received, going back to even 2017, city funding, city ESG or CDBG funding for homelessness programming, we want to see those monitoring reports. If you've received city, say CDBG funding for another type of community development program, I don't know what all they fund, but say like an after-school tutoring program or something, we don't need to see that. We're really looking just at if you've received city funding for homelessness programs, so a shelter program, a street outreach program along those lines. And if you receive HUD funding as well, we want to see your HUD CoC funding, see that audit report as well. We want to see your agency audit, including an A133, if that's applicable. The A133 or the single audit only applies if you expend a certain threshold of federal funding. There will be someone at your agency who knows if that applies to you or not, so just kind of check internally. It may or may not apply, that A133. If there are outstanding findings in any of these audit reports, there will be a deduction of points. We, again, go into detail in the RFP of what outstanding means, kind of what that all means. But essentially, this is a way for us to help ensure that we are not, putting our dollars towards agencies or programming that have, some deficiencies that other funders have identified. Okay, so there are specific application forms. I'm going to switch over to HAND's website for a moment to show the application forms and what is there. Okay. Okay, so folks should be able to see HAND's website. So this is our website, hand.org/continuum of care funding. I will drop this link in the chat box so you can bookmark it. So all of the, again, the materials that I've covered are here on our website. If you are a renewal applicant, just as a side note, all the renewal application materials are there, but for our purposes, new project application materials, the RFP itself is here. I've made reference to the RFP. It is vital that you read through that. I've just sort of skimmed the surface on a lot of things, so it is going to be really, really important that you read the RFP. The project applications are all listed here, and you will notice there are different types of applications depending on what you're applying for. So you just click on the hyperlink and then it'll download as a Word document. So be sure that you are completing the appropriate application. If you're not sure which application form to complete, please let me know and I can direct you. If you are applying for permanent supportive housing, either new or expansion, you must complete this budget spreadsheet as well. These two links are, the spreadsheet is exactly the same. I just linked it twice. Every other application here, your budget form is kind of embedded within that Word document. So PSH is the only one where you do need to download this separate spreadsheet. I want to go over just real quickly. This is an application for new permanent supportive housing. I just pulled this up as an example, just to show you that in the application, there is this checklist. This is kind of one of the first pages that you'll see. And so it is really important that you go through this checklist and that you not only number the attachments appropriately, but that you also look to see, is this something that's attached? Does it not apply? This is really important because it helps me know kind of what to expect in your application. So I know whether or not you have anything that's missing. For example, if you have no monitoring reports from HUD from June of 2017 to March of 2021, you're going to select the not applicable box. Likewise with the City of Detroit. I mean, perhaps you've never received HUD funding or you've never received City of Detroit funding. You're going to check not applicable. And then there's a subsequent question in the application where you're going to indicate the same. But just please review this checklist closely. Again, if you currently receive CoC funding, this will look similar to what's in your renewal projects. Some of the attachments may be numbered differently, but it's very similar. If you're not sure what a certain attachment is asking for, or kind of what you should be attaching, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. So Amy's question, do you want all the monitoring reports from that time period from the city or just the most recent? I do want all of them. So that could be multiple. So I do say from June of 2017 to March of 2021. So so you could have something from 2017 and then the city came out and monitored you again in 2019. I do want to see both because that helps to give us a fulsome kind of picture of, how you're doing from the city's perspective. Yep. Okay. Let me switch back to, okay, so material submission, everything is due, get the screen here, everything is due to me by noon on June 25th, so noon, not 5 p.m. close of business, midnight, but 12 p.m. noon. So midday on June 25th. Please make note of that. We do really take those deadlines seriously. So please plan accordingly. Everything is going to be emailed to me. I had great ambitions of trying to have some kind of online application portal, which just did not kind of come to fruition this year. So we're doing this a bit old-fashioned, and you do need to email it to me. You can send more than one email. If the application and the attachments that you have are large in size and it's not going to go through if you send it all in one email, you can send multiple emails. You can put things in a zip file. That's fine. You'll receive an email confirmation from me once everything has been submitted. Jean, you are correct. Old fashioned is driving it over to you. I actually really always enjoyed when everyone had to drop their applications off in person because I liked seeing everyone come in. So I do kind of miss that. Perhaps someday we'll get back to that. Okay, I'm going to pause for any additional questions. Either you can drop them in the chat. You can, unmute yourself and ask verbally. I will pause. And while I am pausing, I'm going to drop another link in the chat box. This link that I just dropped in the chat box, it goes to HUD's website, where HUD has a number of videos. It's a startup webinar that they did. You'll see it's dated from 2013. So it may feel like it's, what is 2013? Is that 8 years ago already? It may feel like, oh, this is outdated, but it's really not. These videos and this kind of startup training that they go through give sort of a good intro, I guess, for lack of a better word, on the Continuum of Care program and some of the requirements therein. So if you could perhaps use a refresher, or some of this is maybe new to you, I would encourage you to grab that link and kind of peruse some of those items there that HUD provides. Okay. I'm gonna take a moment to look at some of the additional questions. So question is, if I've already received monitoring reports dating back to 2017 for our renewal application, do we need to submit them with a new or expansion application? So couple of things. So one, for your renewal projects this year, the monitoring reports you have to submit are not going back to 2017, and we kind of shortened the looking back time frame to a shorter time frame. However, for the purposes of this new project application, yes, I am still asking you to go back to 2017. So I will acknowledge it may feel like you are submitting something to me that you submitted to me last year. I acknowledge that. It may be something I already have on file. I am still asking for it again, just because depending on when you've received certain monitoring reports from HUD, there may be things that, there was communication back and forth with HUD about clearing findings or addressing what was in the report. So for the purposes of this new application, we are going back to from 2017 to March of 2021, just to make sure that we are really getting a good sort of fulsome look at what those past few years have looked like, kind of from HUD's monitoring perspective. So it may feel a bit redundant and duplicative. Hopefully, if you have everything kind of saved in your own files, it won't be hard for you to kind of get that and email it to me. So yeah. And then question of PSH application, to clarifying that PSH applications need to be strictly geared to chronically homeless single adults. Yes, and you will see how that also plays out in the budget forms. And the reason why we are targeting, again, PSH to the chronically homeless single adults is because that is what the overwhelming need for PSH in our community is. Again, PSH is, first of all, targeted to people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, and people who are chronically homeless are overwhelmingly single adults. And so that is why we are targeting those programs accordingly. So, okay. Okay. I do want to switch gears now, and I'm going to kind of switch over. We're going to go into some details of the PSH budget spreadsheet. You can feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat box. But I'm going to switch over to the budget spreadsheet. So if you are on this webinar and you have no intent of applying for permanent supportive housing programming, we're really going to be talking specifically about this budget spreadsheet. So if you applying for PSH is not something you're interested in doing, you are free to log off and kind of go on with your day. Absolutely free to stay as well. I'm just going to spend probably the next 20 to 30 minutes walking through this budget spreadsheet. Excuse me. So again, keep putting your comments in the chat box as you have them. So you should see this budget, the spreadsheet on my screen. This is a sample form. I filled it out a little bit just to kind of show you how this works. This is the Excel document that you will download from HAND's website that I showed the link to, and then you will include this. You will email this entire Excel spreadsheet to me with your project application. So the purpose for us of kind of really expanding what PSH projects have to include in their budget form was to help to give us, and I say us, kind of the reviewers, the CoC, a broader understanding of your permanent supportive housing program. What we had found in the past with kind of the other budget formats is that it was so narrowly focused to just the CoC funding that was being requested, that was really hard for us to get a better sense of what are the other sources of funding used to support this programming, and what is the entire kind of scope of this PSH project look like? And so that was really why we expanded quite significantly the information we're asking for in the budget. So I'm going to walk through this budget spreadsheet, and I'm walking through this mostly to show you how this spreadsheet works. This is not intended to be guidance on what your permanent supportive housing budget should look like. The numbers that I have here are just made up numbers just to show you the functionality of the workbook. It's not meant to really get to the nitty gritty of like, how do I develop a budget for my PSH program? So as you're completing this spreadsheet, there are probably different conversations you're going to have with different people internally about your PSH budget. So again, I'm going to kind of walk through this spreadsheet to show you how it works, kind of what we're looking for, but in terms of how to develop a budget in and of itself, that's not really kind of what I'm going to be getting at right now. So there are about 7 tabs to this spreadsheet. It goes up to tab G. I'm going to kind of walk through each one. So the first tab, in the instructions tab, is just that. It's instructions. It goes through each additional, it gives you the instructions for each additional tab in the spreadsheet. So as you're going through tabs, B, C, D, E, F, and you want to know the instructions for that tab, go back to tab A. That's the instructions. Throughout this spreadsheet, there are orange cells, it's orange or pink, however it shows up on your screen. Those are cells that have formulas within them, and they automatically populate or they automatically calculate. So you don't need to do any entry into those cells, and you really probably shouldn't do any entry because those orange cells pull from other parts of the spreadsheet. So you don't really need to do any kind of finagling with them. There are then blue cells throughout the spreadsheet where you are going to be asked to enter data as applicable. It's either going to ask for a dollar amount or a description. And then there's some gray cells throughout where there's kind of no data entry that's needed. Okay, so this first tab, the total personnel and ratios. So this tab is helping us to understand all of the staffing positions for your PSH program. And then it also is going to ask for and kind of get to that ratio question, case managers to clients ratio. So, and you'll see how information that you put in this tab is going to kind of pull over into other parts of the tab. So in the top part here, we have these different staff positions that have broadly been identified as would be relevant to a PSH program. You may use different titles within your organization, that's fine. These are just meant to kind of help you get thinking through these different staff positions. So what we would ask then is that you indicate the FTE or the full-time equivalent that that staff position is committed to this PSH project and their annual salary. You can, depending on how you do it internally, if you include, the benefits package in that, that's fine. For this example here, this is just the straight salary. You'll see on the next tab where, benefits come into play. So this, really this question here, or this kind of section here, is again to help us understand all of the staffing that is committed to this project. And I will say too, if you are applying for expansion funding, this should be reflective of everything. If you both what you're currently funded for and if you were to receive that additional expansion funding. So whole scope of your PSH programming. We have, as you can see, kind of spots here for other, project personnel that maybe, in this example, we have a transportation specialist and a data entry specialist. This spreadsheet is going to automatically calculate the total salaries based on what you've both indicated as their FTE and their annual salary. So for example, when it does this calculation, you have this transportation specialist, their annual salary is $32,000. This is only going to calculate, half of that amount because they're only committed as a half-time FTE to this project. So this calculation, it takes into consideration whether or not the person is full-time to the project or not, depending on kind of what you've put in this column here. Then on this tab, you're going to indicate the total number of client households to be served by this project when you're at full capacity. So this may be most kind of direct, you can tell like if you're requesting rental assistance or leasing assistance and you're requesting funding for a certain number of units, say in this example, 60 units. That is the number of households that would be served by this program when it's at full capacity. We know there's times where you may, serve more than that. We know that sometimes happens with rental assistance programs, but in general, the number of units that, the number of households that would be served when you're at full capacity. What then happens, the spreadsheet then calculates, again, if we're trying to get to that 1:20 ratio, it essentially calculates, okay, if you're gonna have 60 units in this project and we want a 1:20 client to case manager ratio, how many case managers do you need? You need 3. That is calculated right here. It then pulls over how many FTE case managers did you budget for above. It pulls that from this line here, 3. So in this case, what we're budgeting for in terms of our case managers would get us to that kind of 1:20 ratio. Okay, Jamie, I'm going to kind of come back to your question a bit. So I do see that you popped a question in the box. Okay, so then that's kind of the first overarching tab, personnel and kind of those ratios. Tab C then asks for your total project budget. So this is asking for more than just the CoC funding request. This is meant to be broader in scope, again, for the entire PSH project budget. And you'll see it first pulls over this salaries total. That $345,000 is being pulled over from the prior tab where it totaled those total annual salaries. So that's pulling over into the total project budget. It then has an option to include benefits. Now, if you had already included benefits, kind of in that prior tab, if that's kind of how you organize that information at your agency, that's fine. You don't have to separate that out. You would then just leave this benefits tab, 0, because you've already included it in the salaries. Then you're going to kind of go through those other personnel expenses, contract personnel, what do you spend on staff development and training? We definitely want to, make sure that that your staff are being supported internally and that, you're identifying and dedicating some resources to staff development and training. And then there's always a spot for other. If you include something that's in other, we would ask that you really, for anything, provide a bit of an explanatory note, just so we kind of know what this is for. So the total, this then subtotal your personnel expenses. This next section, section B, gets into the project operating expenses. So, and again, I plugged in some fake numbers here just to show you again how this would work. So, office rent, office utilities, not your client rent, not any client utility payments, but what your office is. All of these things, communications, office supplies. This is definitely information that, depending on how you manage your programs, you may need to get with your finance staff, your accounting staff to, understand this. I'm sure there's probably some way where you, within your finance department, you prorate things or you calculate things based on this is our entire building and X percentage of our building is used by our PSH staff and that amount is dedicated to, the PSH program. There's a lot there that, it can get a little complex. So that barely scratched the surface of it. So my point being, you may need to kind of make sure you're getting with other folks at your agency to kind of understand these expenses. And some of these may not apply, so fill them out as they apply. So annual staff mileage, you'll see there's an orange cell there. This does automatically calculate. If you, you can kind of choose to do this a couple of different ways. The way we have this example set up is this is the 2020 federal reimbursement rate, and then an estimate of how many miles per month your staff would travel to do home visits. And we have some kind of guidance there on how we came to that. So, you know, again, you may have entirely different information for this, you know, based on how, again, how you do your current programming or record keeping on how many miles your staff drives and the mileage rate that they are reimbursed. If you reimburse staff for mileage, if everyone uses agency vehicles and you have costs associated with fleet maintenance, then, you know, you can include those costs there as well. So we have, you know, a couple of lines for other project costs and, you know, just some kind of blank ones that if there's something there that we haven't captured that you can input. So then we have a subtotal of project operating costs. So now we're moving into direct client expenses. So this is where we're going to look for client rental payments. And so for this one in particular, and you'll see this as I go to the other tabs in this spreadsheet, that the amount that you enter here should be aligned with the amount of rental assistance or leasing that you're requesting in tab D. And so tab D is the CoC funding request. So this is kind of one area where we're going to want to see some kind of alignment there. But so these are client rental payments. If you budget for a client, you know, security deposits, utility deposits, client transportation, perhaps you provide clients with bus tokens or, you know, Lyft or Uber passes, furniture, household goods, maybe you have, you know, any miscellaneous expenses. In this example I gave, you know, we have an emergency food fund that we have set to the side. So just simply kind of indicate here those direct client expenses and then you know, give a bit of an explanation of kind of how did you come up with that amount. So in this example, I kind of give some math. I could be, you know, my math could be laughable, but in terms of what I'm estimating, but it's an example of, you know, how, again, the type of information we're looking for. All right, so then we have the subtotal of the client expenses, and then so total project costs. So now we need to consider your admin, your administrative costs. So in this cell here, you can enter a whole number here, you can enter a percentage. Again, this is going to kind of be however you do this internally at your agency. So for this example, I entered an admin cost of 10% of my total project costs. But again, that's going to be dependent on kind of how that looks at your own agency. Okay, so now I have my total project costs. So in this example, all of my projects, the staffing costs, those project kind of overhead costs, office space, office supplies, and direct client cost is $1,362,000 and some change. That's how much it's going to cost me. So the next portion of this tab is asking where's the money coming from, either known or anticipated, to cover those costs. So this is where we then get into the project revenue portion of it. So the first kind of major, biggest line here is CoC funding. So your requested CoC funding, and this one you're going to see is going to automatically populate with, it's going to pull over from the other tab where you get into the details of what you're requesting in this application. But then it also has places for other project revenue. So either project income, any insurance that you may be billing, other grant funding, or other sources of revenue. And so what we're really trying to emphasize and communicate here is that CoC funding really should not be the sole source of funding for your program. You obviously need to show match. That is going to be another source of funding. But really what we want to see is that there are other sources of funding supporting this permanent supportive housing program. So this is where you would indicate these other sources of funding. And there's other spots when we get to tab E that you'll see where you're going to detail some of those out. So I'm going to pause. Let me look at Jamie's question for just a moment. So Jamie's asking, if we're applying for expansion funding for supportive services, can we add money in the expansion budget to adjust salaries for existing staff in the project to ensure we are able to recruit and retain. I would say, since you just, I would, for existing staff, I would say yes. I mean, so what we're, going to be looking for is really, so the short answer is yes. You're going to apply for the services funding and how that is used, for current staff or to bring on additional staff. So I'm going to say yes to that, Jamie. I hope that answered that question. Okay. I'm going to move on to tab D. So the tab D is where we get to the specifics of the CoC funding that's being requested in this project application. So with your new project application or the expansion application, what is it that you're requesting? So this, Jamie, I see your comment. We can, feel free to reach out. We can talk more individually about that. So this top portion is just a summary. You see these cells are pretty much all orange, which means they are pulling from the information that you're going to fill out below. So there's different, again, this is where you're going to request the different budget lines of what you're requesting in your application, whether you're requesting rental assistance or leasing, operations, supportive services, HMIS. You're going to go through these different budget lines. So in this example, I'm requesting rental assistance. And one of the first things that I do need to do is I need to select what type of rental assistance. There's sponsor-based, tenant-based, and project-based rental assistance. The differences between these types of rental assistance is given in the RFP. There are some differences to them, so please be sure to kind of review that and know what some of those differences are. You'll input then the number of units, and as you can see, the unit size is limited to 0 bedroom, which essentially is, think of it as like that's like a studio apartment, or a 1 bedroom. And again, as you'll recall, we're targeting these PSH programs to single adults. So that's why you're not going to see unit sizes of 2-3 bedrooms like for families, because we're really targeting that single adult population, and so targeting those smaller units. So you're going to input the number of units. This is going to automatically calculate 1-year rental assistance. So it calculates the number of units by the FMR, which is the a monthly amount by times 12 for a year. So you get the annual 1-year rental assistance budget there. And you can see this $591,000 is carried over here into this rental assistance line. And then if we go back to this total project budget, that client rental assistance, that $591,000 is plugged in there as well. So we see kind of some of that consistency there between these different tabs. So going back to the CoC funding request tab. So again, in this example, I'm requesting rental assistance. So I'm skipping over this leased units budget and the leased structures budget. The operations budget, I'm not requesting operations. So I'm skipping down to supportive services. So I definitely want to request supportive services for this program. So again, you're going to fill out in the blue box what you're requesting, give a bit of a description here on, what it is that these CoC funds are buying, essentially, just so we understand kind of how you came up with that dollar amount and, a cost description. So that total amount, that $201.35, again, is going to pull up into that summary budget at the top. In this example as well, I'm also requesting a little bit of HMIS because I need to pay my data entry specialist who's going to be committed to this project on a quarter-time basis. So, requesting $10,000 there. So when I completed these, individual budgets, you can see they all carried over into this top part here. I then have the subtotal, which adds up all of those lines, about $800,000. Now I need to indicate what I do need to fill out in the blue box is how much admin do I want to request. So the maximum amount that you can request is calculated here based on 7% of your subtotal. So in this example, I could request up to $56,151 in admin. I could request less than that if I wanted to, but I can't request more than that. I've decided to, I want to request that full admin amount. So I put that $56,151 in that blue box. So my total CoC funding that I'm requesting in this application is $858,000. I'm sorry, $858,306. The spreadsheet then calculates for me what is my match requirement. So your match requirement is 25% of your total funding that's requested, unless you're requesting leasing, that does not have a match requirement. The spreadsheet does the math for you, so you don't need to worry about backing out leasing. That's already done in this cell. Excuse me. So essentially, your match for this budget is $214,577. So, how do you demonstrate where your match is coming from? That's what these the next two tabs are going to be. So tab E is other revenue and cash match. So on this tab, the first couple of columns here is going to look the same as if we go back to the total project budget. This, everything here under project revenue, anything other than project income, all of these other sources of income, as well as the dollar amount that you indicated here, are pulled over right here into tab E. So you can see these are the same dollar amount. So for example, in my total project budget on tab C, I have Medicaid reimbursement at $50,000, of a grant funding at $200, grant at $150, and another fundraiser at a little over $100,000. That is all pulled over here. So it just copies it right over. You don't need to enter anything. This is where you're going to tell us more information about these other sources of funding. So really just kind of walk through these columns and answer the questions kind of that's being asked. Obviously, if it's grayed out, you don't need to enter anything there. But really what we're looking for, I said I was going to get some funding from a foundation. What's the name of that foundation? Is that estimated or committed? In this case, it's committed. I know I got it. I have the award letter or what have you. I'm also going to do my annual bake sale later this year, and I anticipate getting over $100,000 from my bake sale. But that's just an estimate based on, my fundraising goals or based on what I've gotten in years past. So this helps us to understand if the additional sources of funding coming into this project, again, if they're kind of committed or if it's an estimate. And then we do say if it's estimate, give the approximate date that the funds may be available. And then we want to know how is that funding going to be used within your programming? So just, asking for a brief description there. So for a couple of these, it's my general operating costs, my bake sale, which is, basically private donations, has no regulatory requirements attached to it. I'm using that for general operating. I don't know if anyone does bake sales anymore these days. It sounded like a quaint example to give, and apparently I was hungry at the time. So if any of you do a bake sale, please invite me. Anyway, help us understand how these other sources of funding are used for your project. And then we ask if the source is used as match or not. Again, there is a lot of that could be said about match, allowable sources of match, how you document match. The link that I put in the chat that goes to some of those trainings from HUD, they have one on there specifically around match. So if that's sort of a newer thing for you, I would encourage you to look at that. You can always reach out to me and I can provide links to other resources as well. But essentially we want to know, will this be used as match? If so, how much? And are you including documentation of it as match with your application? Match documentation is not required with your application. If you are able to include match documentation, you may earn more points in your application, but it's not required. So the second to the last tab, tab F, is asking for in-kind sources of match. So match can either be cash or in-kind. Again, there's a lot that can be said about how you document in-kind match. In this example, I am using as in-kind match some volunteer legal services and some furniture donations that I anticipate receiving. So I've filled out information in terms of the value of that match. And then again, if I have a written commitment of that I'm including as an attachment. So at the bottom of this chart here is going to total the total value of my in-kind match. Is going to pull over from tab E the cash match that I'm identifying for this project. It's going to total up my total match that I've identified. And then so right now I've identified $215,000 in match in my budget. This box here is reminding me when I filled out tab D with the CoC funding request, how much match I have to have. I have to have a little over $214,000 in match. I've identified $215,000, so I'm good. I've identified as much match as I need to. If the amount of match I had identified was less than what I need, then I need to rethink, like, what am I going to be using as match for this program? Because you need to, match is a regulatory requirement. There's no kind of getting around it. So you would need to make kind of those adjustments accordingly. The last tab is tab G. This is really just reference and informational. This is copied and pasted from the regulations of what all of these CoC eligible costs mean. If I slide back to tab D with the funding request, you'll see, particularly, for example, in this operations budget or the supportive services budget, you can request funding for maintenance and building security, or you can request funding for life skills or food. Well, what does that mean? Like, how does HUD define that? When it says I can request, food for my clients, or I can, request assistance with moving costs, like, what does that really mean? How is that defined? So that is given in tab G. Again, this is the language from the regulations. It's literally copied and pasted from the regs, which provides additional definition on those eligible costs. And again, if you have questions about these eligible costs, need some further help kind of interpreting that, I can provide you some, assistance there. Okay, so this budget spreadsheet, I acknowledge it's a lot. It does kind of, goes into a lot of detail, and hopeful that, you will find it helpful to really think through in sort of a broader scope your project budget. I'm going to pause at this point for any additional questions. You can either drop them in the chat, or unmute yourself. Again, the spreadsheet format is posted on our website, and really kind of everything that I went over is in this first tab. This instructions tab is kind of that roughly the same thing that I went over here. All right, I will pause for just a moment. And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. So this is kind of the end of what I have. So as I'm kind of closing out here, I do want to just emphasize again that as you dive into this application and you have questions, you're not sure, what application form should I use? What are you looking for in this budget spreadsheet? Don't hesitate to reach out to me with those questions. I can't necessarily give you an answer that's gonna I can't tell you how to answer the question, but I will do what I can to help clarify things, especially if there's things more of a technical nature. I would rather have you reach out and ask rather than just kind of try to guess. So my contact information is in the RFP, but I believe folks mostly have my email address as well. Email is probably the best way to get a hold of me. So drop my email in the chat box there. All right, so seeing nothing else, again, this recording and the slides will be posted to our website. My goal is to get it up there by the end of the day on Friday. And if nothing else, thank you all for your time. I know this was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me for 2 hours. Have a wonderful afternoon.